At 40, 3 times your salary can feel like a verdict. But if you are below it, that benchmark still cannot tell you what the next 25 years require. Use a simple test. Start at 40 with zero invested for retirement. Set an illustrative target of $1 million in today's purchasing power at 65, and assume a 6% real annual return. The equation says about $1,480 a month. That is not what you should save. It is the output of this one model. Change the starting balance, target, return, or retirement age, and the number moves. That moving number, your future contribution burden, is what an age milestone does not start with. 3 times your salary summarizes where one modeled path expects you to be today. The contribution burden asks what your actual starting point requires from here. And before we throw out the milestone completely, it deserves a fair hearing. The familiar 3 times salary guideline is not random. Fidelity's framework assumes a long runway. It is built around saving about 15% of income, including employer contributions, starting at 25, investing over decades, and retiring at 67. Fidelity also says a personal savings goal can differ with retirement age, lifestyle, when saving began, and how much is already saved. Under the modeled path, an age-based milestone can be useful. It gives you a quick reference point. The problem starts when a reference point becomes a diagnosis, because if you are 40 and below 3 times your salary, the milestone does not tell us why. It does not tell us whether the path included a later start, a layoff, years of caregiving, debt payoff, or a very different income trajectory. And most importantly, it still does not tell us what the next 25 years require. There is another trap here. When people try to prove that Americans are behind, they often compare numbers that sound similar but measure different things. The Federal Reserve's latest survey of consumer finances reports median net worth of about $135,600 for families in the 35 to 44 age group. But net worth is not retirement savings. It can include home equity, vehicles, business ownership, cash, financial assets, and then subtract debt. A Congressional Research Service analysis of the same survey gives us a different lens. Among households whose reference person was 35 to 44 and that had defined contribution accounts, IRAs, or both, the median combined retirement account balance was $45,000. Roughly 61.5% of households in that age group had at least one of those account types. Those numbers are useful context, but they still do not let us say the typical 40-year-old has $45,000 and should have 3 times salary. Therefore, the average person is short by X. That would be sloppy. One number is household retirement account wealth among account owners. The other benchmark is based on salary. Different denominators, different populations, different questions. So instead of forcing an apples to oranges comparison, let's use the data for what it can actually tell us. That distinction also tells us what starting balance should mean in this equation. It should be capital that can reasonably be assigned to the retirement goal under the model, not every dollar of household net worth. If your net worth includes home equity, for example, that equity is real wealth. But it is not automatically the same thing as a liquid retirement account. To spend it, you may eventually need to sell, downsize, borrow against the property, or otherwise change how the asset is used. None of those choices should be silently assumed. That is why the Federal Reserve's net worth number and the retirement account number are both informative without being interchangeable. One describes a broader household balance sheet. The other gets closer to assets already sitting inside retirement accounts. For a personal model, the cleanest approach is to decide explicitly which assets are actually part of the retirement funding plan and which are not, then keep that definition consistent all the way through. Those distributions support a narrower conclusion. Real household starting positions vary, and a clean benchmark path is not a description of every household. Missing one milestone is not, by itself, proof of personal failure. It also does not remove the math. Hold the target, horizon, and return assumption fixed, and a lower starting balance forces future contributions to do more of the work. The useful question is no longer whether you deserve to feel behind. It is which input is creating the burden. Go back to our clean model. Age 40, zero starting balance. $1 million in today's purchasing power at 65. At a 4% real annual return, the required monthly contribution is about $1,965. At 6% real, it is about $1,480. At 8% real, it is about $1,100. Same person, same target, same 25 years. A difference of more than $800 a month created by one assumption. There is a behavioral trap inside that spread. If $1,965 feels impossible and $1,100 feels manageable, it is tempting to choose the 8% case because it makes the monthly number easier to live with. But optimism is not a contribution. Picking the return that makes the plan fit does not remove the shortfall. It moves more of the burden into an assumption you do not control. And that is why pretending a long-term return is guaranteed is so dangerous. The return is not a promise. The value of running several assumptions is not that one of them predicts the future. It is that the spread shows you how sensitive your plan is to something you cannot control. There is one more reason to be careful with that 6% number. We are using a real return, which means after inflation. That is why the $1 million target can also be expressed in today's purchasing power. If you switch to nominal returns but keep a real dollar target, you have mixed units and the result stops meaning what you think it means. And even a perfectly consistent real return assumption creates a smooth curve that markets do not actually follow. Real portfolios move unevenly. With ongoing contributions, even the order of the same annual returns can change the ending balance because new money enters at different times. So the 4, 6, and 8% cases are not three forecasts. They are stress tests around a simplified model. Their job is to show the sensitivity of the contribution burden, not to promise one clean path through the next 25 years. Now change something you can observe today, the starting balance. Keep the same $1 million target, the same 25-year horizon, and the same 6% real assumption. Starting from zero requires about $1,480 a month. Starting with $50,000 requires about $1,160. Starting with $100,000 requires about $845. That is a very different way to think about being behind. There is no magical line where you cross from fine to doomed. There is a moving burden. The lower the starting balance, the more future cash flow has to do. The higher the starting balance, the more of the job can be carried by the capital already there. And now, the phrase catching up becomes more precise. Catching up is not an emotion. It is a change in required inputs. Suppose, just for translation, the person in our zero balance example earns $75,000 a year. $1,480 a month is roughly 24% of gross income. Again, that is not an instruction to save 24%. It is the output of one model. But the size of that output tells us something important. Advice that might be perfectly reasonable for someone with 40 years of compounding can fail to produce the same endpoint when the runway is 25 years. Imagine saving 10% of $75,000. That is $625 a month. Under the same 6% real return assumption, starting from zero at 40 and continuing until 65, that grows to roughly $423,000 in today's purchasing power. That does not mean 10% is bad. It means 10% does not solve this particular $1 million problem under these assumptions. And that distinction matters, because personal finance becomes misleading when a rule is judged without asking what problem it was designed to solve. At 25, a savings rate guideline has time doing a huge amount of the work. At 40, the same percentage has less time. But there is another way people distort this conversation. They treat the $1 million target as if it were handed down by physics. It is not. A retirement portfolio exists to help fund a future spending gap. If your future spending is lower, if Social Security covers a meaningful share of it, if you have a pension, if housing costs fall, if you work longer, or if you have other assets, the private portfolio needed to support that gap may be lower. If your spending is higher, your retirement begins earlier, your housing costs remain high, or outside income covers less, the target may be higher. So the real chain is not, I am 40, therefore I need $1 million. It is, what future spending gap am I trying to fund? What portfolio target corresponds to that gap under reasonable assumptions? And what contribution burden does that target create from where I am today? That is more complicated than 3 times salary. It is also much more useful. Social Security is a good example of why the target cannot be universal. The benefit formula is progressive. Lower earners generally receive a higher replacement rate relative to their prior earnings than higher earners do. So 2 people with the same retirement account balance can have very different levels of retirement readiness once outside income and spending are included. But Social Security also should not be treated as a perfectly fixed future number. Under current law, someone who is 40 today has a full retirement age of 67, not 65. And the 2026 Social Security Trustees Report projects reserve depletion in the 2030s under current law unless lawmakers address the financing gap. That does not mean Social Security disappears. The report projects that continuing program income would still cover most scheduled benefits at reserve depletion. It means a 25-year plan should not turn today's scheduled benefit into an unquestioned constant. That changes what behind means. At first, the scary question was, how far behind am I? But that question compresses 5 separate variables into one feeling. Your starting balance, your target, your time horizon, your contribution rate, and the return range you are using to test the math. Once you separate them, behind stops being a permanent identity. It becomes a description of the relationship between those variables. And some of those variables are more flexible than they first appear. Take the horizon. Our original example stops at 65, but current Social Security full retirement age for a 40-year-old is 67. If our purely illustrative $1 million model extends from age 40 to 67 instead of 65, while keeping the same 6% real assumption and 0 starting balance, the monthly contribution falls from about $1,480 to about $1,275. Extend the same model to 70, and it falls to a little over $1,000 a month. Working longer is not automatically possible, desirable, or healthy for everyone. That is exactly why this is a sensitivity test, not advice. The point is to see what time does to the equation. The same is true of the target. At 0 starting balance, 25 years, and 6% real, a $750,000 target would require about $1,110 a month. A $1 million target requires about $1,480. A $1.25 million target requires about $1,850. Those are not 3 recommendations. They show that the target itself is one of the largest levers in the equation. If the target is only a round number you inherited from someone else, the monthly burden can look precise while the goal underneath it is still arbitrary. If $1 million is merely a convenient round number, then changing it should not feel like breaking a commandment. A household that expects a smaller spending gap may need a lower private asset target. A household expecting a larger gap may need more. The number is downstream from the life, not the other way around. And this is also why I would be careful with the idea that the tax code leaves a 40-year-old no room to catch up, because age-based catch-up contributions begin later. For a standard 401k, a plan may permit extra catch-up contributions once a participant reaches the qualifying age, while a 40-year-old is not eligible for that age-based amount. But the federal elective deferral limit for 2026 is $24,500, although an individual plan can impose a lower limit. Our base example requires about $17,744 per year. So under this model, the age-based catch-up is not the binding constraint. That is a small detail, but it is a good example of complete math versus incomplete advice. A true fact can still be irrelevant to the decision if it is not the constraint actually limiting the outcome. The same standard should be applied to employer matches. A match can materially change how much of the total contribution has to come directly from the employee. But match formulas vary, eligibility varies, vesting varies. Pretending everyone gets a 5% match would just replace one generic assumption with another. So if you are testing your own numbers, employer contributions belong in the inputs, not in a universal script. Put those pieces together and the age benchmark has a narrower job. It is not useless. It is incomplete. It is like seeing that you are 10 miles behind a checkpoint without knowing how far the finish line is, how much fuel you have, or how fast you can actually travel. The checkpoint can alert you. It cannot calculate the rest of the trip. And there is a psychological reason that distinction matters. A static milestone encourages identity statements. I am behind. I messed up. I should have started sooner. Some of those statements may be historically true. Starting earlier usually gives compounding more time. You cannot recover 25-year-old time at 40. But repeating that fact does not produce a decision. A forward-looking equation does. What is my current balance? What spending gap am I actually trying to fund? What target am I using? And why? How many years does the money have? What range of returns am I willing to stress test rather than assume? What total contribution does that combination require? Those questions do not guarantee a comfortable retirement. They do something more modest and more honest. They turn a vague fear into variables you can inspect. And sometimes the result will still be uncomfortable. Maybe the required contribution is far above what current cash flow can support. That does not make the equation a failure. It means the original combination of target, horizon, starting balance, and assumptions does not fit the current cash flow. Something in the model has to change, not because a guru says so, because the numbers cannot all be true at the same time. Maybe the future spending target is different. Maybe the horizon changes. Maybe income changes. Maybe the plan depends more heavily on outside income. Maybe the current goal really is difficult. The important thing is that you can now see where the pressure comes from. That is the part a milestone cannot tell you. So if you are 40 and the famous 3 times salary number makes you feel late, do not pretend the benchmark is meaningless. It may be telling you that your path has diverged from the assumptions behind it. Just do not confuse that with a complete diagnosis. The number that matters next is not another age milestone. It is the contribution burden created by your own starting balance, your own target, your remaining time, and a realistic range of assumptions. A benchmark tells you where one path expected you to be. The math from today tells you what your path would require from here. And those are not the same question. If you want more breakdowns that take a familiar money benchmark and rebuild the math from the assumptions underneath it, subscribe. The goal here is not to replace one rule of thumb with another. It is to know which number you are actually looking at.